There was no single concrete motive. Then, whatever was the reason? And what the young man said made absolutely no sense at all. He seemed unable to explain it very well himself, beyond saying he just couldn't stand it any longer. There really are foolish people in the world, aren't there? But when you think about it, you can understand his feelings. When farmers increase their workable land, they have that much more to do. In the final analysis, there's no end to their labor, and they only wind up with more to do. However, the farmer at least has a return on his potatoes and rice. Compared with the farmer's work, shoveling away the sand is like trying to pile up rocks in the river of Hades, where the devils cart them off as fast as you throw them in. Well, what happens with the river of Hades in the end? Not a single thing. It's an infernal punishment precisely because nothing happens. Well, then, what happened to the sun after that? He had planned the whole thing in advance, and had probably even settled on a job beforehand. And then what did he do? Well, he went and took his job. And after that? Well, after that, he probably got his pay on payday, and on Sundays, I suppose he put on a clean shirt and went to the movies. And then? We'll never know unless we put the question to him directly, will we? And when he saved up some money, he probably bought himself a radio, didn't he? At last, he thought. He had finished his climbing, but he had come only halfway. No, that was wrong. It was already flat here. Where had the lights that he had fixed on gone to? He had continued walking with the feeling of disbelief. The place where he stood was apparently the ridge of a rather high dune. Why ever couldn't he see the lights from here? A feeling of apprehension paralyzed his legs. Perhaps his previous laziness was the cause of his failure. He slid down the steep slope, heedless of the direction. It was an unexpectedly long ravine, not only deep but wide too. Many lines of rippling sand lay tangled and confused at the bottom. They troubled his judgment. Even so, he couldn't understand at all why the lights of the village were not visible. His margin of error was not more than half a mile on either side of his line of advance. He may have missed his way, but it could not be serious. He wanted to go left, but perhaps because of his fear of the village, he also felt he should strike out boldly to the right in order to get nearer to the lights. Soon the mist would lift and the stars would come out. The quickest way, in effect, would be to climb up to any elevated place, regardless of where it was, and get the best perspective he could. Still, he couldn't understand. He did not understand at all the reason why the woman had to be so attached to that river of Hades. Love of home and obligation have meaning only if one stands to lose something by throwing them away. What in the world did she have to lose? Radio and mirror, radio and mirror. Of course he would send her a radio, but wouldn't it work out to the contrary that she would lose more than she would gain? For instance, there would be no ceremony of giving him a bath, which she liked so much. She always used to save water for washing him, even at the expense of the laundry. She would splash warm water between his legs, and, quite as if she were doing it to herself, bend over, squealing in laughter. There would be not another chance for her to laugh like that again. No, she shouldn't be under any misapprehension. From the beginning there had been no contract between him and her, and since there had been no contract there could be no breach of contract. Furthermore, he too was not completely untouched. For instance, the stink of the cheap sake that came once a week and seemed as if it had been squeezed from a compost heap, the flexing of the flesh on the inner side of her thighs, where he could see the muscles standing out in ridges, the sense of shame in scraping away with a finger he had wet in his mouth, the sand like burnt rubber that had gathered on the dark lips of her vulva, and her bashful smile that had made these things appear more indecent. If he added them all up, they would come to quite a lot. Even if his involvement seemed unbelievable, it was none the less a fact. A man, more than a woman, tends to abandon himself to bits and pieces of things. When he thought about what the villagers had done, he realized that it would be almost impossible to calculate the harm he had suffered. The relationship between him and the woman was of little importance. He intended sometime to take a full measure of revenge on them. He hadn't yet decided what would be the worst. At first he had thought of setting fire to the whole village, or putting poison in the wells, or laying a trap to lure them one by one into a hole in the sand. He had spurred himself on whipping up his imagination by thinking of such direct measures. But now that he would have the opportunity of actually putting them into practice, he couldn't continue thinking such childish things. After all, the violence of a single person wouldn't amount to much. The only way was to make his complaint to the authorities. Even if he did, he was somewhat concerned as to how much of the cruel significance of the experience they could grasp. Well, for the time being, he would report it at least to the prefectural police. Ah, yes. And then there was one more thing. Wait, what was that noise? He could no longer hear it. Maybe it had been his imagination. By the way, wherever had the lights of the village gone? Even though the land was uneven, it was really too absurd that they were nowhere to be seen. He could easily convince that he had tended to swing to the left, and having veered too far in the direction of the promontory, was screened from the village by some high ridges. He could waste no time. He would strike out boldly, to the right. Finally, there was one more thing he did not want her to forget. She had never been able to answer his question. It had been raining for 2 days. When it rained, the force of the sandslides increased, but there was much less flying sand. Since they had done a little extra work on the first day of rain, they had been able to take it easy on the next. Taking advantage of the first period of leisure in some time, he had determined to push on tenaciously with the project. He had decided he would try to get at the reason that kept her in the hole, and he would go about it with the same patience one has in picking at a scab left from some skin disease. His perseverance had surprised even himself. At first, he had cheerfully let the rain strike on her naked body, but at last she had been driven to the point of tears. Finally, she began to say something to the effect that she couldn't leave simply because of the remains of her child and her husband, who had been buried along with the chickens' houses on the day of the typhoon. Well, that was understandable. It was quite rational of her, and he could even comprehend her reticence in not speaking to him about it until then. But anyway, he had decided to believe her. He had once determined on the following day to devote some of his sleeping time to looking for the remains. He had continued digging for 2 days at the place she had indicated, but he had not found even a trace of the chicken bones, to say nothing of any houses. Then she had pointed out another place. He could not find anything there either. And then she indicated still another. He had dug vainly in this way for 9 days in 5 different places, and then she had begun to make excuses, looking as if she were about to begin crying again. She had said that the location of the house had evidently changed, shifted by the constant pressure of the sands. Or perhaps it might have been that the hole itself had shifted. She had also said that the chicken houses and the remains of her husband and child might well have been buried under the thick wall of sand that divided her house from her neighbor's, and that they might have moved into the neighbor's garden. It was theoretically possible, certainly. Her unhappy, beaten expression obviously showed that she hadn't meant to lie, but that she had no intention of telling him from the very beginning. The remains, after all, were no more than an excuse. He had not had the strength to get angry, and then he had decided to leave off trying to figure out who had indebted to whom. She would certainly understand this, he thought, but what's that? He threw himself headlong to the ground. Everything had happened too quickly. He couldn't grasp the situation. Suddenly, the village lay before him. He had apparently been walking straight toward the sandy promontory that was adjacent to it. At the instant the prospect opened before him, he found himself in the very center of the hamlet. Before he could collect his thoughts, a hostile barking sounded from a nearby brushwood fence and was picked up by one dog and then another. In the dark, a circle of white fangs pressed in on him. He pulled out the rope with the shears, sprang up, and began to run. There was no choice. The only thing to do was make a direct run for the village gates. He ran. The houses, floating in the vague light of burning lamps, formed a maze of obstacles and passageways along the single path of his flight. He could taste the wind wheezing through his tightened throat like a lukewarm rust, a desperate gamble on a sheet of thin glass that was already bent to the breaking point. The basket gangs had certainly left their houses already, but it was still too soon to expect them to have covered the distance to the seashore. In fact, he did not remember hearing the sounds of the three-reeler. He could not possibly have missed the put-put of the crazy two-cylinder engine from at least a half-mile away. The situation was extremely dangerous. A black lump suddenly sprang out from the shadows. It was a fairly big dog, judging from its breeding. The dog, however, had evidently received no training in attack and had committed the blunder of barking just before it was about to sink its teeth in him. He lashed out with his rope, and the shears struck something. The dog let out a baleful howl and melted again into the shadows. Fortunately, it had only bitten into the cuff of his trousers. His legs slipped out from under him as he recoiled, and he turned a somersault as he fell. At once he was on his feet again, and running. However, there was not just one dog, but apparently 5 or 6. Discouraged, perhaps, by the failure of the first, the others awaited their chances as they circled around him, barking. Maybe the squat red dog from the shack was urging them on from behind. Then he jumped over a mound of shells in an empty lot and ran between some narrow brushwood fences, cutting through a garden where straw was spread out to dry. At last he came out on a broad road. Only a little more and he would be out of the village. Just beside the road there was a small ditch. 2 children, who looked as if they were brother and sister, scrambled out. He noticed them too late. He did what he could to bring the rope around to his side, but it struck them, and all 3 tumbled into the ditch. Something like a wooden pipe lay at the bottom, and the dull sound of splintering wood accompanied their fall. The children screamed. Damn! Why did they have to yell so loud? He pushed them away with all his strength and clambered out. At the very instant the beams of 3 flashlights lined up, blocking his way. At the same time the alarm bell started to ring. The children were crying. The dogs were barking. And at every sound of the bell his heart jumped a beat. His pores opened, and 1,000 prickly little insects, like grains of rice, came crawling out. One of the flashlights seemed to be of a type that had an adjustable focus. And just when he thought the light was dwindling, it suddenly pierced him again like a white hot needle. Should he try a frontal attack, kicking them aside as hard as he could? If he could just get across there, he would be outside the village. He might regret the tactic later, and then again he might not. But all depended on this instant. Come on, don't hesitate. If he didn't seize the opportunity now, it would be too late. He couldn't count on a second chance. Even as he was thinking this, the flashlights, poised in a half circle around him, spread out to the left and the right and slowly approached him. He grasped the rope more firmly and knew he must move, but he only stood there with his toes biting into the soft ground, unable to come to any decision. The places between the flashlights were filled with the dark shadows of men, and that obscure shape by the side of the road, which at first looked like a hole, was certainly a three-reeler. Even if he were successful in getting through, he would be caught from behind, and back of him he could hear the steps of the children who had stopped crying, running away. Suddenly, a magnificent idea occurred to him. He would get the children and use them as a shield. By taking them hostage, he could stop the men from coming nearer. But when he turned to pursue them, he could see the other lights waiting for him. The road behind had been cut off too. He recoiled and, gathering his strength, ran back along the way he had just come. His decision was a kind of reflex. He hoped to find some place where he could cut across the dune that lay adjacent to the promontory. The men from the village yelled as they ran after him. His knees felt weak, as if his joints had loosened. Perhaps he had been in too much of a hurry, but for the time being at least, he seemed to have taken them by surprise, and he was able to keep enough distance between him and them in order to turn around now, and then to see where they were. How far had he come, he wondered. He had already run up and down several dunes, yet the more he strained, the more he seemed to be running vainly, dreamily, in one place. But this was no time to reflect on efficiency. There was a taste of honey mixed with blood on the back of his tongue. He tried to spit it out, but the substance was too viscid. He put his finger in his mouth and scraped at it. The alarm was still ringing, but it was already far away and intermittent. The barking of the dogs, too, had become a peevish, distant chatter. It was his own breathing, like a file on metal, that was the disturbance he was aware of now. The three pursuing lights were still in a line, wavering up and down, and while they did not seem to be coming closer, neither did they seem to be getting any further away. It was just as hard for him to run as it was for them to run after him. From now on, it was a question of endurance, but he could not be very optimistic about that. The strain had perhaps lasted too long. His mind suddenly seemed to buckle. In this moment of weakness, he even hoped his strength would give out, and he would have done with the whole thing. The symptom was dangerous, yet it was still well that he realized just how dangerous. His shoes were full of sand, and his toes began to hurt. Looking around, he perceived that his pursuers had fallen back to 7 or 8 yards behind him. On the right, why had they gotten off the track like that? Perhaps they had tried too hard to avoid the slopes, and had ended up by bungling the chase. Apparently, they were pretty tired too. The pursuer, they often say, tires more quickly than the pursued. He paused and hastily took off his shoes to run barefoot. He stuck them into his belt, since they would be a bother if he put them into his pocket. Recovering his spirits a little, he ran up a fairly steep slope in a single burst of speed. If things went like this, and he had a little luck, he might give them the slip yet. Although the moon had not risen, The countryside was splotched with faint patches of bright and dark from the starlight, and he could clearly distinguish the distant ridges. He seemed to be heading for the end of the promontory. Again he felt the urge to bear to the left. As he was about to change direction, he was suddenly brought up short. If he changed, he would at once shorten the distance between his pursuers and himself. He was thunderstruck, aware for the first time of their plan. Their pursuit, which at first seemed implausible, was in fact very well thought out. They were trying to push him in the direction of the sea. Without knowing it, he had been guided. When he thought about it now, he realized that the flashlights were meant precisely to let him know their positions. The way they kept their distance without coming near was certainly done on purpose. But it was still too soon to give up. He had heard that there was a way to climb up the cliff somewhere, and if it turned out to be necessary, it would not be impossible to swim over to the back of the promontory. He thought of being caught and taken back. There was no room for hesitation. Abrupt descents followed long, gentle rises, abrupt rises, then long, gentle descents. One foot after another, one step added to the next, like stringing beads. Patiently, patiently. Unnoticed, the alarm had ceased. He could no longer distinguish between the sounds of the wind and the sea and the ringing in his ears. He ran up a hillock and looked around. The pursuers' lights had disappeared. He waited for a moment, but they did not reappear. Had he really gotten away? He wondered. His rising hope made his heart beat faster. If it were true, it was all the more reason he should not relax now. One more dash. On to the next rise. Suddenly, it was hard to run. His legs felt strangely heavy. It was not only the feeling of heaviness. His legs had actually begun to sink. It was like being in snow, he thought, and by then he had sunk to his calves. Astonished, he pulled out one foot and the other sank quickly, until he was knee-deep. What was happening? He had heard of sand that swallowed people up. He struggled, trying to extricate himself in some way, but the more he struggled, the more deeply he sank. His two legs were already buried up to the thighs. Ah, so this was the trap. Their target had not been the sea at all, but here. They intended, quite simply, to liquidate him without even going to the trouble of capturing him. Liquidation, indeed. Even a sleight of hand artist could not have done it more smoothly with his handkerchief. And other puff of wind and he would be completely gone. Even the best police dog would be helpless. The bastards didn't even have to show their faces anymore. They hadn't seen anything or heard anything. The stupid outsider had lost his way by himself and had vanished. They had managed the whole thing without soiling their hands in the slightest. Sinking, sinking. Soon he would be up to his waist. What in God's name could he do? If he could increase the area of contact with the sand, his body weight per square inch would be lighter, and perhaps he would be able to arrest the sinking somewhat. He flopped down, his arms spread out. However, it was already too late. He had intended to lie on his stomach, but the lower half of his body was now fixed vertically in the sand. It was impossible to keep his already exhausted hips at a right angle for any length of time, unless one were a trained trapeze artist. Sooner or later, there would be a limit to this position. How dark it was! The whole world had closed its eyes and stopped its ears. No one would even turn around to look at his death spasms. Fear convulsed his throat, and suddenly burst out. His jaw dropped, and he gave an animal-like cry. Help! The stock expression. Well, let be a stock expression. What was the use of individuality when one was at the point of death? He wanted to go on living under any circumstances, even if his life had no more individuality than a pea in a pod. Soon he would be up to his chest, to his chin, to his nose. Stop! This was enough. Help! Please! I'll promise anything. Please! Help! Please! At last, he began to weep. At first his sobbing remained under control, but soon it changed to unrestrained bawling. He submitted to his fear, and the horrible feeling that all was lost. There was no one to see him. It made no difference. It was too unfair that all this was actually happening without any of the formalities being observed. When a condemned criminal died, he at least left a record. He would yell as much as he wanted, since no one was there to see. He might as well. And so, when voices called to him suddenly from behind, his surprise was all the more shattering. He was completely defeated. Even his feeling of shame vanished, like the shriveled ash of a dragonfly's wing. Hey, there! Take hold of this! A long piece of board slid down to him and hit his side. A circle of light cut through the darkness and fell on the board. He twisted the disabled upper part of his body, entreating the men he felt were behind him. Pull me up with this rope, won't you? No, no, we can't pull you out, as if you were Root. A laughing voice broke out behind him. He could not be sure, but there seemed to be 4 or 5 of them. Just hold on a little longer. We've sent for a shovel. Just put your elbows on that piece of wood, and you'll be all right. He placed his elbows as he was told and cradled his head in his arms. His hair was soaked with perspiration. He felt no particular emotion except that he wanted to have done with this shameful situation as quickly as possible. Say, there, you're lucky we followed you. This is a regular mush around here. Even the dogs stay away. You really were in danger. Lots of people have wandered in here without knowing it, and they've never come back. The place is a mountain cove. There's a lot of drifting. In winter, the snows blow over, and the sand over that. Then the snow comes again. This has been going on for about 100 years until it's become like a pile of thin crackers. At least, that's what the old Union chief's second boy said. The one who went to school in town. It's interesting, isn't it? If you dig down to the bottom, you may find something valuable. Whatever was he telling him this for? He could stop talking so innocently any time, as if he didn't know the truth. It would be better if he would just show his colors, or he would at least prefer to be left alone with his own tattered resignation. At length, there was a commotion behind him. The shovel had evidently arrived. 3 men wearing boards attached to the soles of their shoes clumsily began to shovel around him, in a wide circle. They stripped the sand away in layers. His dreams, desperation, shame, concern with appearances, all were buried under the sand, and so he was completely unmoved when their hands touched his shoulders. If they had ordered him to, he would have dropped his trousers and defecated before their very eyes. The sky had grown lighter, and it looked as though the moon would soon rise. How would the woman welcome him back? It really made no difference to him any more. Now he was nothing more than a punching bag to be knocked around.